What if the real story of the Vatican isn't about what it hides, but about what people project onto it? Because when an institution exists long enough, it stops being just a place in history. It becomes a surface people use to reflect belief, suspicion, and meaning. I'm Eric, and I follow We Are All Energy on Facebook. And this documentary is based on a review of narrative-style content shared publicly by a creator named Stacey, alongside historical records and widely available information about the Vatican and early Christianity. The goal here is not to prove a hidden truth, and not to dismiss belief either. It's to separate three layers that often get blended together: what is historically verifiable, what is interpreted through meaning, and what cannot currently be proven either way. Because when those layers collapse into each other, understanding gets replaced by narrative. This is an attempt to slow that down and look at each layer on its own terms.
The Vatican is a sovereign city-state located inside Rome, and it serves as the administrative center of the Roman Catholic Church. It is one of the most documented religious institutions in the world, with a continuous historical record stretching back centuries. At the center of its administrative structure is the Vatican Apostolic Archives, which preserve millions of historical documents. These include diplomatic correspondence, papal records, theological writings, and political communication with kingdoms and governments throughout history. What these records show is not a single unchanging system, but a long and complex evolution of religious doctrine, political influence, and institutional decision-making. Early Christianity itself was not uniform. Multiple texts circulated in the first centuries after Christ, reflecting different theological perspectives and communities. Some of these texts were later included in the biblical canon, others were not. Examples of non-canonical writings include the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary. These works reflect early spiritual interpretations that differed from the doctrines later formalized by the institutional church. What emerges from the historical record is not mystery, but process. A process of debate, selection, and consolidation over time.
When you look at institutions like the Vatican, the historical record is only part of the story. The other part is how people interpret what they don't fully see. Because large institutions don't just exist in documents or buildings, they exist in the human imagination. They become symbols. For some, they represent spiritual authority. For others, political power. And for many, they represent control over information itself. This is where interpretation begins to form. Not necessarily from evidence, but from gaps in understanding. When information is incomplete, the human mind naturally tries to complete it. It connects patterns, it builds structure, it assigns intention. This process is not unique to religion. It happens in politics, history, finance, and technology. Any system that is large, complex, and partially inaccessible tends to generate interpretation around it. Some of the material reviewed for this documentary, including narrative content shared by Stacey, reflects this process directly. It takes gaps in historical understanding and builds meaning around them. Sometimes symbolically, sometimes literally, and sometimes in ways that blend the two. What matters here is not whether these interpretations are right or wrong, it is understanding how they form in the first place. Because once you see how meaning is constructed, you start to see the difference between history, interpretation, and belief more clearly.
As interpretation expands, some narratives move beyond symbolic meaning and begin to make specific claims about hidden systems, technologies, or structures beneath the Vatican. These claims often describe advanced technologies, energy systems, or secret knowledge stored beneath religious institutions. In some cases, they suggest global networks of control tied to historical religious authority. However, when we examine these claims through verifiable historical, archaeological, and scientific records, there is no supporting evidence for them. No confirmed excavations, documents, or peer-reviewed findings support the existence of hidden technological systems beneath the Vatican of the kind described in these narratives. What does exist are documented historical records, architectural layers, and extensive archives related to religion, politics, and diplomacy. The gap between what is verified and what is claimed is where speculation emerges. This is also where narrative content, including material shared by Stacey, often blends symbolic interpretation with literal framing. Some ideas are presented as metaphorical or spiritual frameworks. Others are presented as factual claims. For clarity, these must be treated differently, because interpretation can be meaningful without being literal, and meaning does not always equal evidence.
Even after separating verified history from interpretation and unsupported claims, there are still important questions that remain open. Not about hidden systems or secret technologies, but about human perception itself. We still do not fully understand how consciousness works. We don't fully understand why humans are drawn to symbols, rituals, and layered meaning systems across cultures and time periods. We also don't fully understand why institutions, especially long-standing ones, become focal points for both trust and suspicion at the same time. In psychology and anthropology, there is ongoing research into how people construct meaning when faced with incomplete information, and how belief systems form around gaps in knowledge, uncertainty, and historical distance. These are not fringe questions, they are active areas of study. What becomes clear is that uncertainty itself plays a role in how narratives form. When information is incomplete, the mind doesn't stop. It continues building patterns, connections, and explanations. This is part of how humans make sense of complexity. And it is not unique to any one topic, institution, or belief system. It is a general feature of how we think. Which is why distinguishing between what is known, what is interpreted, and what is unknown is so important. Because without that distinction, all three begin to blend together.
Before closing, it's worth briefly stepping back and reviewing the types of claims presented throughout the material. Not to dismiss them, but to place them in context. Some elements are grounded in verifiable history. For example, the Vatican does maintain extensive archives, including documents that are not fully accessible to the general public. Early Christianity did include a wide range of texts and perspectives, some of which were later excluded from the biblical canon. These points are supported by historical research. Other elements fall into a category that is speculative or unverified. These include interpretations about global energy grids, symbolic architectures carrying hidden functions, or the idea that institutions influence belief systems at a subconscious level. While these ideas are not supported by scientific evidence, they often reflect symbolic or philosophical interpretations rather than literal claims. Finally, there are claims that are not supported by credible evidence and conflict with established knowledge. These include assertions about hidden advanced technologies beneath the Vatican, pre-flood civilizations with modern-level machinery, or global systems of control tied to undocumented physical mechanisms.
There is no reliable historical, archaeological, or scientific evidence supporting these claims. Understanding these distinctions matters, because without them, it becomes difficult to tell where history ends and narrative begins. And once those boundaries blur, interpretation can start to feel like fact. Separating them clearly allows each idea to be evaluated on its own terms, without confusion and without assumption.
And once those distinctions are clear, what remains is not just what we know, but how we choose to understand it. When we step back from all three layers, history, interpretation, and uncertainty, a clearer pattern begins to emerge. Institutions like the Vatican are not defined by a single narrative. They are defined by scale, time, and human meaning projected onto them across generations. What is documented shows a long history of religious development, political influence, and cultural authority. What is interpreted shows how people try to fill gaps in understanding with symbolic or structural meaning. And what remains unknown reflects the limits of human knowledge, especially when dealing with systems that span centuries. When these layers overlap, the result is often confusion between what is proven, what is believed, and what is imagined. But separating them does not diminish their importance. It actually makes understanding stronger. Because history becomes clearer when it is not mixed with speculation. Interpretation becomes more meaningful when it is not mistaken for fact. And unknowns become more honest when they are acknowledged as unknowns. In the end, the Vatican, like any institution of its scale, exists in multiple forms at once. A physical place, a historical record, a symbolic structure, and a subject of ongoing interpretation. Understanding which layer you are looking at is what determines whether you are seeing history, or meaning, or something in between.